Hi, I'm Darren Kassler, a 35-year veteran of Amarillo broadcasting. In my career, I've been a DJ, I've done news, I've done sports, I've even produced a few programs. And I learned it all from the very best. People like Royce Botiford and Bill Sexton, John Dawson and Phil Woodall. Sadly, some of these people are no longer with us. So we thought it would be a good idea, at a reunion recently, to put them all in front of a camera and let them tell their stories in their own words. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did.
I'm Ron McCoy, and my media career started in about 1957. I was a Navy pilot flying from Kwajalein Island to Hawaii, and we lost an engine. And when I got to Hawaii, we actually landed at Johnston Island, a little dot on the map. And when they come rescued us, we landed the plane on Johnston Island. And when I got to Hawaii, they wanted to interview me. And when I finished my interview, the guy told me, said, "Man, that's a good interview. You have a possibility of being a medium buck." And that's where it started. I went off to college, and when I was working on my master's degree up in Greeley, I hear this guy on the radio saying, "Hello, this is Ricky Wright, and we're going to rock and roll tonight." And I said, "Ricky Wright? I got an uncle that goes by that name." And I called up the station and I said, "Is this Colonel next?" And he said, "Who is this?" I said, "This is Roy McCoy. I'm your uncle." And he said, "Well, why don't you come on out?" He was doing radio up in Greeley. So I went out to the station and did my studying while I was working on my master's degree. And one night he came and said, "You know, I've got this headache and I can't even see this copy. Go in and read that off of the UPI machine and read over it, and you can do the last newscast. Nobody's listening anyway." It was 2 o'clock in the morning. So I went in and read it, and I did the newscast, and the phone rang, and I heard him say, "Well, yes, sir. Well, yes, sir. Well, that's a relative." And he said, "Now you've done it." And I said, "I just did what you said." And he said, "Well, the guy sent for me to hire you." And so I started doing radio up in Greeley, and that was the beginning of my radio career. The guy came through, and he heard me on the air, and he's opening a station in Gallup, New Mexico, called Kiva. That's the Indian for hold on. And so I did radio with him for about 2 years. And the sportscaster got sick, and he said, "Do you ever do sports?" And I said, "No, but I've always thought I'd like to." And he said, "Well, go out with him and do a sportscast." So I went out, and he did the first half. No, I did the first half, and he said, "If you can't do it, he'll take over." So I did the first half, and the guy called and said, "Just leave him, let him do it." So that was my beginning in radio. And I went up to Farmington, New Mexico from there. The guy owned the same station, KENN Radio in Farmington, and I was their sportscaster and a morning DJ. And from there, I came to Amarillo and did radio here for KFDA radio, the old KFDA. And then I went to what is now KAMR, and did sports with Dick Reisenhuber, did the baseball play-by-play off the tape. And from there I went over to KFDA TV and did their sports, and Dan True was doing the weather, and he couldn't do it one day because of an accident his son had, and he just went in and he pulled off the microphone and laid it on the floor and said, "I'm not ready yet." So I looked around, and I was the only one there. I was doing on the sports too, and I picked up the microphone and did the weather. And because I was an all-weather pilot in the Navy, I knew about the weather. So that's where my weather started, and I did that for 12 years in sports with the KFDA. And then I went to KAMR and did all the rest of my radio for years and years and years at KAMR, and retired from there. And then Big John Harris had no broadcast clause when he went to KAMR, so he had to wait six months before he could do it. So I substituted there for a little while and did weather for the 6 months. And then when I retired, that was the end of my broadcast career. And I loved every minute of it. I don't even remember a time when I thought, "Man, I hope I don't have to go to work today." I was always glad to go, and was voted the top forecaster in the whole state of Texas by the Broadcasters Association. And I have that plaque hanging on my wall. So that's my radio career, and I'm proud of it, enjoyed it, and glad I ended up in that business and retired from it.
Hello, my name is Paul Matney, and I'm very pleased to be here today to talk a little bit about my career in broadcasting. I had the good fortune of spending 19 years working in television in this market in Amarillo. I worked for 8 years at KVII Television under Lynn Slesick, who was the chief meteorologist, and I did primarily the weekend weathercasts. We had 5 shows on the weekend. We had 2 shows on Saturday and then 3 shows on Sunday. Lynn Slesick is one of the finest people in Amarillo, and it was a joy to work for him. He taught me a great deal. I had had 1 course in meteorology in college, and so I really trained under Lynn. It was a great team. That was the days of Pro News, and Jim Pratt was the news director at the time. Woody Van Dyke was doing sports. Lynn Slesick was doing the weather, and the co-anchor had been a fellow who ended up leaving the station, and then I believe Don Robbins started doing Hotline to Politics, and Bill Tel Zortman worked there at the time. Mark Baker, Phil Woodall came in and anchored our weekend newscasts. It was a really, really good team, and learned a great deal about television there. Then in 1980, I had the opportunity to go over to KAMR, Channel 4, the NBC affiliate, and I got to work for Roy McCoy, and I spent 11 years there. So I've always felt like I had the good fortune of working for 2 of the nicest guys in Amarillo. Lynn Slesick for 8 years, and then 11 years for Roy McCoy. And we had a number of news directors at the time: Lynn Walker, Steve Snyder, and Channel 4 was a great place to be as well. It was the longtime NBC affiliate. I think it was the first station to sign on the air in Amarillo back in 1953. I remember as a kid watching Bob Izzard do the news, watching people like Dan True do the weather, and so it was really nice for me to work at both Channel 7 and also Channel 4 and be able to work with and among some of the folks that I grew up watching in Amarillo television. Back in those days, we were exclusively film. We shot 16mm film. Our cameras were CP16 film. That meant that from the time the news film went into the processor until it came out dry, that took 28 minutes. It then had to go into the newsroom, and news people had to sit down on a bench, and they would put earpieces in to hear the sound on film, and they would cut the film to match their story that they had written beforehand. And then all of those news stories were spliced together onto one large reel, and it was rushed back to the projectionist just before the news began at 6 or 10 or whenever. We had 1 cameraman on weekends that operated 2 studio cameras. Buddy Squires was a young man I met. He became one of the best news photographers and producers in the market, but I knew him as a 17-year-old kid from Tascosa High School. I got to meet people like Alan Schifrin, who spent a career here in Amarillo television, and so those are wonderful memories working in the 70s and 80s. I worked from 72 to actually 91, but it was always a part-time job for me because my full-time job was in education, teaching 8 years at WT and 35 years at Amarillo College. So have a great deal of respect for Amarillo broadcasters. It's always fun to get together every summer and have our reunion luncheon. And I want to thank Scott at Fantasy Photography for letting us come in and tell some of our stories and background in Amarillo broadcasting.
Hi, I'm Phil Woodall. I've been in Amarillo since 1974. I got out of the United States Air Force. I was stationed at Cannon Air Force Base over in Clovis, New Mexico, and actually did some work at KCLV Radio before doing part-time weekend sports at Channel 10, KFDA, from April through July of 1974 on a part-time basis. And then when I got out of the Air Force in July of 74, I started work at Channel 10 doing weekend sports, and then moved over to Channel 7 where I did some weekend news and moved up to co-anchor. Also did Hotline to Politics, which is our political program. And then after that, moved on to the newspaper, and then became Just the Peace in Randall County for 23 years, from December 4th of 1979 until December 31st of 2002. During that time, I was actually doing some broadcasting of sports for High School and also for West Texas A&M University. And after that, after retirement from WT in 2011, I've been doing high school sports on radio and on the internet. So it's been a terrific career. I believe broadcasting is the part that gave me an opportunity to further my political career and got me well known in the area, because back in our days, ABC 7 News, as it's now known, we were Pro News back then, learning under the great Jim Pratt. We were the dominant #1 in news coverage in the area. So it's been a great career. I've enjoyed being around many of the colleagues that have been mentioned in this videotape. It's a great career to be around. It's wonderful, and part of the reason I stuck around, obviously, I didn't have all the talent to move on to higher markets, but this is an excellent market to get a good training in. And it's also wonderful, the people that have worked here. And there have been some very good ones that have gone on to bigger and better things, as you well know. So again, we thank you for listening, and to some of these old people who have been involved in broadcasting. And remember that the younger ones, they're coming on now, and they're going to have an opportunity to tell stories when they get old, just like we are right now. And thanks to Scott, all the people at Fantasy Photography for taking care of us. And we thank you very much for watching Old Broadcasters back alive with you. Bye-bye.
I'm Dale Scarberry, a veteran of Channel 4. I went to work at KGNC TV in December of 1965, and I worked there until August of 1975. And my first day on the job was a Saturday, and we did a deal called the Kiwanis Auction. And if memory serves me right, we did it, I think there was an old car dealership south of the Herring Hotel, and that's where we did it. So that was my introduction. I had been going to school, I'd been in the Army, going to school, got married, was unloading boxcars of brick. So a cameraman's job at KGNC Television was a piece of cake, and I was making $1.50 an hour. So I told the guys I went to work for, I said, I'll work every minute that you can give me. And I worked 7 months without a day off, and I've never in my life had a job that I loved like being a cameraman at KGNC Television. I couldn't wait to get to work in the morning. So I worked my way up. I became a projectionist, and then I became the studio manager, and I became a director, and then I became the production manager, and ended my career as the operations manager. And my way out of the suit in the office was to shoot my own motion picture film for the commercials. So that was my deal, and I spent a lot of ag, did a lot of ag stuff, a lot of feed yards, a lot of green crop, blue sky, red tractor type stuff. And in 1975, after a couple of ownership changes, I moved out and bought into a deal called Film Lab Inc., and we did all the sports processing and shooting for the area high schools and colleges. Football was the main deal, and then basketball, and to a lesser degree track. Wound up with a lab in Odessa and a lab in Wichita Falls. And all that lasted until the '91 season, and there was a deal called No Pass, No Play, House Bill 72, and it got our business. They mandated a bunch of changes, and but they didn't fund them. So athletic director told me, he said, partner, he said, when it comes down between helmets and film, guess what? We're gonna buy helmets. So I started gearing up. I geared up with real high-end professional 16mm stuff and some video stuff. And although I'd been shooting, I was 46 when I went freelance. And we were doing music videos and commercials. And so that's basically what I've done. And in 1993, we fell into Republican politics, my son and I. And I think between the two of us, we've probably done 12 or 1,300 campaigns all over the United States. And it ranges from county judge to presidential stuff. And the big difference, the pay's the same. Big difference is the bigger the race, the nicer the hotel they put you in. That's about it. But I would tell you that the 10 years I spent in broadcasting, probably with the exception of the last year and a half, it was an absolute blast. It was a different business then. A guy working as a projectionist or a control room engineer or a director could make a living. He could buy a house, he could support his kids, he could support his wife. I don't think that's true any longer. I think it's all minimum wage stuff now. But it was really a lot of fun. Met some really great people, highly professional. It's kind of interesting, especially the news people. When I got in the mid '60s, were still holdovers from radio, and they came out of basically the pecking order was newspaper to radio to TV, and those people could write. Half the time now, even a newspaper article or especially a news story on television, after it runs, you don't have a clue what happened. But those people could really write. And a big influence for me was a sports director named Dick Risenhoover, who went on to be the voice of the Texas Rangers. Dick was a lifelong chain smoker. He was thin as a rail, and he came down, I think, with lung cancer. And he was with the Rangers only just a few years before he died. But I came up with Cotton John Smith, those guys, and it was a big experience. And there's lessons I learned during those days that still stick with me today on how we do things, the shortcuts we use, and whatnot. But I'll be 74 next week, and I'm still plugging, still going, and continue to go. Hopefully when I go face down, the shot will be in focus.
I remember meeting Bob Izzard when I was 9 years old. What an impression he made on me. And then little by little, I would meet more celebrities locally over the years. I remember the magic of radio, listening to Chicken Man and other stories. It was such a great time for imagination and to get to meet people who really had their heart in the broadcasting business. And in high school, I became a mascot for Amarillo High School on the air, and I got to do that for about 3 years. I was a very shy person, and it helped me not be so shy. Over the years, I got to be more and more involved in the business. I went to work for Ad Image Advertising Agency. I worked for Sandra Curry, Bill Hayes, Roger Williams. Got to meet so many people that way. Then got to represent more people in their advertising. Doug Collins was a good friend. He always introduced me to famous radio stars, country stars coming to town. I met so many of them, and little bit by little bit, I got into the industry, and still do commercials for a company called Welcome Partner. I'm glad to work there.
Okay, Tom Higley. Started out in '65 working at the old KGNC, AM, FM, and TV until '76. Then I worked for the city for a couple of years and came back when Mel Tillis came to town and bought Kicks, put K-Mel on the air. Worked for him for 8 years. Then I got back in the newspaper business and left town for a while. Anywho, I got started in this at a real great opportunity in time. We tried to cover the Southwest, and this was before everybody could shoot video and get it sent by satellite everywhere. We just had to go out and get our stories. I got to cover 3 national Republican and Democratic conventions, including the '68 convention in Chicago, and I was at the riots and everything with Dick Risenhoover. And then other stuff was Miami Beach and Miami. For Republicans and Democrats. Anything political, I was the one that got to go out and cover it. Chief photographer, street reporter, general whatever, and wound up being assistant news director and the political director there for a while. An executive producer of the 6 and 10 o'clock newscast for about 5 years. I worked with some of the neatest people in the business here in Amarillo, from Keith Adams and Bob Izzard and some of the old heads. They were fabulous teachers for me. and it was exciting life. And we did things such as fly to Texarkana and shoot a story on the rats that they had in Texarkana. And I've always wondered why we did it, but we did it. Then when Mel Tillis came to town, I'd been out for a couple of years, and I decided I wanted to get back in. And I was talking to some people, and they said, you need to go out and talk to the Tillis people. They're looking for a news director. And I thought, I don't want to work for a country station. Well, I'm glad they talked me into it, because that was the most fun, being in that radio operation with those great people out there at Kix and then later KMEL. And back on TV, we shot the first color film, and I shot it and put it on the air in Amarillo. And I was part of the newscast. It was the first full newscast in color here in town. And we just did a lot of good stuff, and we're ahead of the game by a few days in most cases. But we had just a bunch of real good people. Went on, thinking back on who was there, Bob Brandon, Robert Brandon as we called him. We had another Bob Izzard, so we named Bob Brandon, Robert Brandon. He went on to be National Cinematographer of the Year for the NPPA, once in Houston and once when he moved up to Denver and opened up his own shop up there. He was one great WT grad that came into our operation, and I learned from him, and I think he learned from me. And in radio, we had Doug Collins, and Doug was a former National Western Country Music Disc Jockey of the Year for the nation. And it was fun working with him, fun working with the other people out there at Kix KMEL.
I think probably the most enjoyable was actual broadcasting, gathering the story, putting it together, putting it on the air, and probably was the most enjoyable. The most enjoyable part was getting the feedback from your audience. It's been a great run. I've enjoyed every minute of it. Had over 40 years of broadcasting, and as I said earlier, be sure and choose a job you want. I came in the back door. Nowadays, you probably would want to study journalism or study broadcast. The other day, someone asked me how I got started in the broadcasting business of radio and television, and what interested me in that particular field as a career. And I thought back over the years, and I'd like to share with you my story about how I got involved in broadcasting. We have to go back to the days of high school, and I was an FFA member in high school in a rural school in Parker County, Texas, about 45 miles west of Fort Worth, or about 15 miles west of Weatherford. You may not have heard of it, but it's a little place called Millsap, halfway between Mineral Wells and Weatherford. It was at that particular time that I developed an interest in activities, public relations type work, public service work, all those things. And really what piqued my interest in that organization was the fact that my ag teacher took me to Dallas to an FFA convention back between my sophomore and junior year. And I thought, gee whiz, what a great thing those young people are doing, and maybe I could do that. So I went back and I took advantage of all the opportunities I had, like public speaking and doing things of leadership activities and so forth. And it came time then, I thought the last thing I can do is run for a national FFA office, which I did, and was successful in becoming a national FFA vice president. Now there are 6 presidents, or 6 vice presidents, and we served for a year and traveled all over the nation. I could stay home, farm, and continue my activities there on the farm on the weekends, go to school during the week. During that time, I married Helen, my childhood sweetheart. I had a call one day from a gentleman in Amarillo. He went by the name of Cotton John Smith. Well, Cotton John Smith was a farm broadcaster, and Cotton John Smith had done a lot of work in the newspaper, and he was a journalist, a professor at East Texas State at one time. in my travels as an FFA ambassador, I was on his television radio programs, and of course I developed a friendship with him, and that friendship evolved into pretty close contact, and he knew I was at Tech in Lubbock. Called me and says, hey, I need a person to help me in my department. He had a 3-man farm department. I said, no, I need to get my education. I've worked hard, and working at this lumberyard is really a tough job. But then I got to thinking after I talked to him, I said, gee whiz, this school is going to be here a long time, and that job won't be. So reconsidered and said, okay, I'll come to Amarillo and interview. Actually, my background was agriculture, and I was studying agriculture to be an ag teacher. And he said to me that I can teach you to broadcast. I can't teach you agriculture because that's part of your life. You've grown up there and you've been 21 years involved in agriculture as a child on up to adulthood. So I thought, well, that sounds reasonable. If he has that much confidence in me, we might give it a try. So I took the job and dropped out of school, much to the protest of my professors. And I gave them the same excuse, hey, you're going to be here a long time. This university will be here for a long time. That job is available right now. Well, I finally worked my way up through the ranks, and if you're interested in wages, I went on to work there at $75 a week. And then I got a job offer in Shreveport, Louisiana at a radio station to do the same type of work, except I would be the boss. Didn't have the support with the number of people that I did at KGNC in Amarillo, both radio and TV, but moved down to Louisiana. Interesting, agriculture in the Red River Valley is much different than it is on the plains of Texas. I guess I did a good job for KGNC because the management offered me the job to come back to KGNC and take Cotton John's place. Well, those are big shoes to fill, and I was about approaching 30 years old at that particular time. But I was highly honored to be asked to come back because I recognized the importance of agriculture in the panhandle area of Texas, eastern New Mexico, and the Oklahoma panhandle. So we covered about 3 or 4 states. Television was also important in the plains area, but to farming, radio was more important than TV at the time. Whenever the television station sold and I had to make a decision of which way to go, we were given choices. I took the radio side because most of the agriculture advertising was on the radio side rather than the television side. And farmers had easier access to radio when they did TV at the time. So we went that route, and I broadcast as a farm and ranch reporter, go out and interview people, take best practices that farmers and ranchers were doing, put those on the air, and this went on for several years. And I spent about half of my career doing that type of broadcasting. Then I became involved in sales. Then I became general manager of the radio station. And it was there I spent a good part of my remaining years and retired temporarily. Days have really changed over the years on how you gather information and what you do with it. Back in the day when I first started, which was the year was 1959, we had these huge recorders we carried around. It was an Ampex 600 series, and it was about the size of a normal size suitcase. And we carried those things around with an accompanying bag of microphones, extension cords, a lot of equipment to go along with it. Great recorder, I mean studio quality, but it was heavy, heavy, heavy. This was for radio. For television, we had huge cameras. We used 16 millimeter film, and they come in the big rolls. And also, they were heavy, heavy, heavy too. And we would use those. We used speed graphic still cameras, and the equipment was just huge. All of it was very huge. After we got past the film part, we came into videotape in the 60s. Used to, if you did a commercial, say you had an agricultural building and they wanted you to do their commercial for you. Then you would come out during the 10 o'clock news, and you would actually use studio cards, or you would use teleops and slides and other things, as well as introduce it on television live. And you hoped that that camera went off of you before you ran out of what you had memorized of that commercial. Most of the time it did, but you always had that fear, because you know the director of the television and also the camera people and all, they sometimes play tricks on you. And usually they didn't in a case like that, but you always had that fear. They've got the switch, they've got the control, and here I'm in the studio trying to do a commercial. It was interesting, those early years, and how equipment has changed so much since that particular time. Technology changed so much. Those old scoop lights that were in the TV studio were just hot as they could be. You would really sweat. And today, of course, you've got modern lighting that's very cool and gives plenty of light, and it just makes a whole lot of difference when you're in the studio doing work. Out in the field, a lot of things have changed there too. Video cameras are very light and easy to handle. You see people carrying those around nowadays from news departments everywhere. And they also have, we used to have a crew that would actually go out and do the filming and so forth. You'd never go out with less than a professional camera person, operator, back in the old days. But nowadays you see most of the news people doing a lot of their own things. One of the interesting things I think about the broadcast business is the fact that the interviews that we used to make, we didn't do much editing. We tried to frame the interview such that whenever we did an interview, we did it in a package. If you wanted to say, okay, I'm going to do 2.5 minutes, 3.5, whatever it might be. And you had kind of a sense of timing, although we used stopwatches, that you would do the interview. And I mean, you play it back intact, particularly radio, and no editing at all. And probably more editing in television at the time, where you had the old film splashers that you worked with, and you cut it and taped it and glued it back together and hoped it didn't come apart when it went through the projector. But anyway, it was really an exciting time, and to see the different things change. Nowadays, you know, teleprompters are used. I never got comfortable with the teleprompter, which is very unusual because it's supposed to make it a lot easier, but it was easier to talk, for me to talk to you, than it was for me to read to you. So I got along better just talking and ad-libbing than I did with actually a script that was on a teleprompter as far as the television is concerned. Now radio is a little different story. You need script more for radio because you got to really keep it rolling on radio, your speech, or else, you know, there's a big blank dead spot there, and dead air is not good. So those are some of the big changes that were made and so forth. Well, I thought when I came to Odessa 22 years ago that I had really made a change, because I did a little work in Austin before I came to Odessa. And I'd tell people, they'd say, where did you come from? And I said, well, I came from Austin here. And they'd say, my, that's a cultural shock, isn't it? And I said, no, not really. And they'd look at me like, you don't mean that's not a cultural shock? And I said, no. I said, I used to broadcast in Amarillo. They said, oh, well, if you were in Amarillo, that's a whole different story. But anyway, the reason I got here in Odessa is the fact that a friend of mine, John McCarroll, that I had known when he worked for the Cattle Feeders Association in Amarillo, was the general manager of the public broadcasting station here, both the NPR station and the television station, KOCV. And I had talked to him. I had found out about the job opening for general manager at KOCV, licensed to Odessa College at that time, and decided that, well, I believe I really miss broadcasting. I want to get back into it. So I asked for an interview and was granted an interview, came to Odessa, interviewed, successfully got the job, and moved to Odessa, and was the general manager of both those stations for the next 8 years, and that carried it to my retirement time. So that was a great thing, and it gave me two views of broadcasting. I had the commercial view from broadcasting in Amarillo and Shreveport, Louisiana, and then I got the public broadcasting view from broadcasting PBS and also NPR radio. And of course, they're two different worlds, but very interesting, and I enjoyed both. And retired, and that's the reason I wound up. If you told me 25 years ago that one day you're going to be in Odessa, Texas, I'd say, what? What do you mean, Odessa, Texas? I got retired, and seems like you always can find a good job after you retire. They don't pay a whole lot, but you can get a good job in public service work. So, well, that's my story, and I've enjoyed telling it. Thank you for listening and watching it, and I hope that it's been of some value to you.
The Broadcasters Luncheon is one of my favorite events of the year. These guys and gals are the ones who really set the standard for broadcasting in the radio and TV industry here in Amarillo. And to hear their stories is really amazing. I mean, this goes back to when you had the newsman shooting camera for the weatherman, and the weatherman turning around and shooting the camera for the newsman, and one guy in control, 3 people putting on a newscast, where now it's 13 to 15 people it takes to put on a newscast. And they did it because they loved it, not necessarily for the fame and the glory of it, because it was a difficult job. I call them the good old days, and some of the older broadcasters say that's because you didn't live them. But to hear their stories and to really feel the joy when they're telling those stories is not so much just about what they're saying, but how they're saying it. You can tell that even the ones who've been out of the broadcast industry for 50 years still love telling the stories, and broadcasting is still in their blood, and that's what makes these people so special. So I enjoy very much hearing the stories and being able to rub shoulders with some of the legends in broadcasting and radio and TV in Amarillo. It really is a brotherhood, a kinship, a fellowship that's unequaled in any other industry that I've encountered.